At a cost rumored to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 million, the Galactic StarCruiser, Disney's failed Star Wars hotel in Orlando, Florida in Galaxy's Edge, closes today for good. And questions that surfaced several weeks ago when it was announced that this day would be coming are surfacing yet again. What went wrong? Well, a lot of people want to throw out a bunch of theory and conjecture, but the answer, quite frankly, is very simple, and it's something that Wall Street had better start taking notice of with the Walt Disney Company sooner rather than later.
Renegade Online.
Well, folks, welcome back. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. It's good to see everybody out there once again. And if you are like one of the many folks watching this video, not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment and turn that little red subscribe button to gray. Hit that like button, hit that notification bell, share this sucker out on the social medias, and of course, please do leave a comment before you head out the door today. And join us today, Sunday, October 1st, for the live show at 6 p.m. Eastern and every Sunday right here on Valiant Renegade. And we will be covering this more in depth on the live show with our panel of guests and experts to talk about what happened. But let's go through this article from an Orlando publication. Disney Star Wars themed hotel is set to close for good. What went wrong? A former Disney Imagineer gives their take on the Galactic StarCruiser's failure. Disney announced earlier this year the company would be closing the Star Wars-themed Galactic StarCruiser Hotel with its final voyage scheduled from September 28th to September 30th. That was yesterday, folks. The announcement came as returning CEO Bob Iger implemented his plan to cut back on an estimated $5.5 billion in costs for the company, including thousands of job cuts and the cancellation of its Lake Nona project. While the hotel wasn't spared in the company's cost-saving measures, former Disney Imagineer Ryan Harmon told News 6 in Orlando that there were steps that Disney could have taken to make it work better. Just so folks watching understand the scope of the cost saving, it's not only about the operational costs of the hotel itself, which were enormous, as the article will go into. The number of staff they had to have that completed the quote-unquote immersive experience would cost Disney a ton of money more than they were actually taking in from guests staying at the 100-room hotel. That's problem number one. Number two, of course, Disney could save themselves a bunch of costs in terms of depreciation, meaning they're going to write the whole hotel off at this point, as opposed to taking a multi-year depreciation process. So that $400 million that they may have invested building this hotel, getting it set up, planning all of the shows and the immersive experience, as opposed to having to take write-downs on taxes over the course of, say, 10 or 15 years, they're going to accelerate that depreciation now, having closed the hotel, and get a much bigger write-off this year, saving them a bunch of money. In other words, the Star Wars hotel is worth far more to Disney, shut down and terminated, than it is in operation. The Disney Imagineer says, quote, they created an experience that can only host up to about 400 guests. When you have that few, you can't operate with a large staff because those people cost a lot of money, said Harmon. And the concept they developed is very heavy on employees who wear costumes and are a part of the story. I think where Disney kind of lost their way with the whole Star Wars book, with Galaxy's Edge and with the hotel, is that they went in with the assumption that everyone was an uber fan, everybody was a diver, that everybody coming into the experience would have a deep, deep, deep understanding and connection with the brand. Harmon added that the cost of the hotel was too much for those who aren't huge fans of the original source material. Now let's break right there because they're skipping over a major problem with this hotel. It wasn't based in the original source material. It wasn't based in actual Star Wars that was created by George Lucas. It didn't base itself in the Star Wars that made billions and billions and billions of dollars of profit over the course of 3 or 4 decades before Disney got its hands on it. The hotel was based strictly in Disney's brand of Star Wars, the sequel trilogy, which we all knew long before this hotel was built was a failure. Yes, the movies each did over $1 billion at the box office, but that's because of that Star Wars brand name tagged in front of it. The merchandise sales fell off sharply from one movie to the next, and the fan interest dwindled to almost nothing, especially after the third and final part of the sequel trilogy came out. And let's not forget that Disney spent nearly $3 billion making and then marketing 5 Star Wars films into the theaters, they didn't make the kind of money that a lot of people think they did, especially not when you consider the costs and what Disney actually gets back from the theaters at the end of the day. We can debate as to the reasons why that was the case and some of the treatment of the characters in those films that probably led to that fan dismay and them leaving out the back door, but that's for another video. We've talked about that plenty before, and it doesn't matter. The reality at the end of the day simply is the Star Wars brand was heavily damaged by the Walt Disney Company because Disney does not know how to manage and perpetuate its own intellectual properties anymore. And this is something that Wall Street is going to have to wrap their head around. It's not just Star Wars. It's things like Marvel, as we've seen come into phases 4 and 5. Look at the sharp decline in interest in those films, especially when you take the fact that movie ticket prices have inflated so much since 2019 when Endgame came out, the end of the Infinity War saga. Since then, we're talking about movie ticket prices that are on average 30+% higher than they were back then. And the box office figures for those films are still sharply lower on average. That means that somewhere near half or maybe more than half of the Marvel Cinematic Universe fans have exited out the door. How about The Little Mermaid? One of Disney's most beloved and popular IPs, something that should have been a layup for the company months ago when it came out in May. But it wasn't. Why? They radically altered too much of it for modern audiences in a live-action remake, and it went over like a lead balloon. Sure, $500 million is a great box office run if you're something like John Wick and you have a tight budget. But in the case of Little Mermaid, when you're talking about a movie that they spent nearly $300 million to produce or thereabout, that's a real problem. And then, of course, there's Snow White, a movie that people are already writing off is going to be a massive box office flop for Disney, thanks to the star of the titular role being played by Rachel Zegler and her, well, open mouth. So many people have the idea of the Star Wars universe that was formed by the earlier films, the Lucas films, that is. And I think we've had kind of an oversight on Disney's part not to let people spend more time in those worlds, Lucas's worlds, choosing the worlds from the earlier films and those characters from the earlier films. And in case you may not know or haven't heard us talk about this before in years past here on Valiant Renegade, the original intention for Galaxy's Edge was the original George Lucas trilogies. You would have had Tatooine, Hoth, and Endor, not whatever it is now. We haven't even seen Batuu in a Star Wars movie yet, and yet that's the headline land in Galaxy's Edge. It's unidentifiable. It's unrecognizable by fans. And then even Disney's own creations seem to have gotten the shaft. As an example of the bad management, my words I'm going to throw in there, Harmon noted that when he visited Galaxy's Edge in California years ago, around when the Mandalorian TV series had initially been released, at the time, he couldn't find any Baby Yoda dolls for his young daughter. Quote, "The employees literally told us that Grogu or Baby Yoda does not exist in that world," Harmon explained. The land or place exists between this story in this film this year, and the character doesn't exist at that time. Congratulations, Disney. You managed to immerse all of your guests into your multi-billion-dollar capex on 2 Galaxy's Edge theme parks into commercial failure because reasons. Harmon argues that because the resort tried to emphasize the franchise's canon by removing characters that didn't belong, that'd be the Disney franchise canon, not actual Star Wars canon, much like how Galactic StarCruiser omits characters to let guests explore the modern Disney Star Wars films, they were leaving money on the table. No, they left all the money on the table. However, he did add that, quote, "I would definitely applaud Disney and the management team for taking the risk to create an overnight immersive experience because until then, it really didn't exist," Harmon said, and it's definitely what people want and where things are going. If you look at the success of Comic-Con, for example, people who want to role play, they like to dress up, they want to be immersed in the story, and they want to have agency. But once again, the problem is the story they chose to immerse people in. Disney had a chance to make this legitimate Star Wars that would have opened up the market for the number of people willing to pay even those exorbitant prices right out of the gate. They have tiered systems of things like this. Those early adopters are willing to pay nearly anything, and then you can gradually reduce prices over time to meet the largesse of the general audience that would still be willing to spend maybe a few $1,000s to go have a 2-night immersive, real Star Wars experience. But that's not what Disney gave us. What Disney gave us was this, a cheap Walmart version of Star Wars, their own brand of Star Wars, and quite frankly, based on many of the videos we saw, rather poorly executed. And this goes back to what we started the video with. Disney does not know how to manage correctly its own intellectual properties. And it doesn't look like it's going to get any better anytime soon. Disney is stubborn, and they seem stuck on stupid, especially when it comes to things like Star Wars. They seem far too stubborn to want to go back to the brand of Star Wars that they paid $4 billion to acquire, the brand of Star Wars that they have since largely abandoned. In fact, the only thing that's keeping merchandise sales going for Lucasfilm and Star Wars right now is the classic Star Wars brand, something that was even highlighted in a recent financial report, a quarterly report from Disney during an earnings call. I've made the argument before, and I'll make it again right now. Disney would have been better off spending $4 billion on Star Wars and then doing absolutely nothing with it. If they had not invested the extra $2 billion in 2 theme parks and a hotel that they've now closed down, if they didn't invest another $3 billion in films that arguably collapsed the franchise in on itself and drove off the biggest portion of the paying fan base that was out there. If Disney had avoided all this and just sat on Star Wars as it was, licensed out some rights, licensed out the EU, continued to make new toys and toys from the classic series, they might actually be profitable right now. But instead, Disney is shuttering $400 million capital expenditures on things like hotels that failed after a year that said Star Wars on it. Make sure you're subscribed to Valiant Renegade and join us every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern for the live show.